Welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. This is Mara and Ben. Recently, Wizards of the Coast decided to incorporate the Magic the Gathering multiverse into Dungeons & Dragons. This, of course, creates a bunch of new campaign settings as well as character races, and I'm sure there's going to be a whole lot more to come. They started this process, they dipped a toe in the water a few years back with the Ravnica expansion, which was an expansion, and that's kind of all we really have to say about Wizards delving into that for the moment. But what's important to understand here is that Magic the Gathering is a very different setting than anything you're used to seeing in D&D. In D&D, you have Eberron, you have Greyhawk, you have the Forgotten Realms, Spelljammer, and one or two others. The Magic the Gathering multiverse is a whole lot more diverse.
Oh yes, in D&D, while we do have other worlds such as the planar system, so you have the elemental plane of fire and things like that, as well as the outer planes and the far realms, in Magic the Gathering the system is completely different. You have they're still called planes, but they're completely separate, contained ecospheres and such, which can occasionally interact, and that has happened in a few expansions. But usually they're fairly isolated from each other, with special people called planeswalkers walking between them. For a long time, people even speculated that the Magic the Gathering universe could be what the Far Realms were, just because it would be so alien to the D&D universe. But with this expansion, that has been proved false definitively. And so it's important to remember that while there might be a Ravnica expansion, for example, that's not going to be the same as if they release a book on New Phyrexia, for example. That would be very different campaign settings. Every world has a different theme. Some are borderline child-friendly, while others, like Innistrad, deserve an R rating most of the time. To continue with that example, one is a grimdark fantasy, one is almost sci-fi utopian. So yeah, there's just a lot of variety in the Magic the Gathering universe, and in my opinion, it's a great thing that it's being incorporated into D&D more, because while we all love D&D, there isn't a lot of variation with the exception of the Eberron book. Otherwise, it plays almost exactly the same. The world feels very similar most often, so having these pre-built worlds that Wizards can draw on really adds a diversity and a depth to D&D, which I feel was sorely needed.
And to expand a little bit about what Mara was talking about in terms of the different planes and the planeswalkers, there is, for example, a plane called Ravnica, which is one massive city. The entire plane is covered by a city. The city is ruled by a series of guilds. There is a guild dedicated to preserving what's left of the natural world called the Selesnya Conclave. There's a guild dedicated to sort of returning the ruins to the wild called the Gruul. There is a world called Mirrodin, which is a world almost entirely of metal, and even things like elves and humans and goblins have incorporated metal into their bodies to make them more able to exist on this plane. There is a plane called Lorwyn, which is, as Mara was saying, it almost reads like a fairy tale or a fable. The villains are not scary at all. But Lorwyn periodically turns into Shadowmoor, which is the exact opposite. It's a dark mirror of the same world, and the rotation happens periodically. In addition, and I say very importantly for potential D&D campaign material, there are characters called planeswalkers. What a planeswalker is a being that is born with the planeswalker spark. It's never truly explained where the spark comes from, and it can exist in anything. So a human, an elf. There's a golem that had the planeswalker spark named Karn, who was very important to the storyline of Magic the Gathering. In the older expansions, the planeswalkers were essentially godlike. In the newer expansions, they're still very powerful. They have powerful magical abilities, and they've retained the ability to move between the planes essentially at will, but their powers have been greatly reduced, so at least in theory they can be killed. You can interact with them on closer to equal terms. An excellent BBEG is one of the oldest planeswalkers in the game, Nicol Bolas. Before he became a planeswalker, he was an ancient dragon who was also a high-level wizard. So, I mean, he was a great BBEG before his spark activated, and now he's a planeswalker in addition to his other abilities. He's on a quest to return at least himself, if not all the other planeswalkers, to their godlike status. And something that struck me as a very interesting potential for a campaign is that in the storyline, a character called Umizawa from the plane of Kamigawa had managed to trap Bolas in a magical prison for, we're not sure how long. Time works a little bit differently in the MTG multiverse. But it seems to have been a really, really long time. And so it would be a really interesting campaign, I think. Bolas was freed from his prison, and he has sworn revenge on the descendants of Umizawa. So, your players are all descendants of Umizawa. Now, they don't have to be from the plane of Kamigawa. Remember, planar travel is possible, and given the amount of time that's passed, it could be a really interesting character development moment that your person who thinks of themselves as a high elf turns out they had a great-great-great-grandfather who was a human, who was a descendant of Umizawa, and now this planeswalker wizard dragon is after them.
Yes. And just before I hop into one of the most notorious planeswalkers in both universes, I will also make a note to explain something about planeswalkers, which is, if planeswalkers are a thing and they are relatively common in the multiverse, then why isn't every plane aware of the existence of other planes? And the answer is fairly simple and has been explained before, which is that normal mortal beings are not fully able to comprehend what a planeswalker is capable of, nor are they able to comprehend what other creatures are capable of. The only things that are reliably able to perceive planeswalkers that are not planeswalkers themselves tend to be artificial constructions like Karn, who was the golem that was pre-mentioned, and Memnarch, who wanted to become one, but himself was an artifact. And so that is just the explanation for that. And now, getting into D&D, you're probably thinking, oh, well, planeswalkers don't integrate that well into D&D because there's no mechanics and none of them exist in the D&D universe. That is wrong. One of the most infamous is Mordenkainen. He is a planeswalker. This has been confirmed because there is a planeswalker card in Magic the Gathering with Mordenkainen. He's actually one of the most powerful in the current edition. And on top of that, it's mentioned in D&D that a lot of his spells don't make any sense for the universe, which implies that he's traveled between universes, and it only makes even more sense because he couldn't have traveled to the Far Realms because it would have killed him. So there's definitely that, and I suspect that Tasha, who is the fictional author of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, might also be a planeswalker, given her extreme level of power that she can make negotiations with the demon lords unaffected. And you can keep on going on and on with this. There are so many characters in D&D where if you want to, you could pretty easily turn them either into a planeswalker or into someone who knows about planeswalkers, like I forget his name, but the big villain who's trying to kill God, the Lich, Acererak. Yes, he could be like Memnarch. He could be trying to gain the planeswalker spark by killing all of the D&D gods.
And a quick note about that, the Planeswalker Spark doesn't automatically activate. It is possible for one being to steal it from another. That was part of the theme of the Mirrodin expansion, as Mara mentioned. The other theme was making Magic the Gathering completely unplayable as a game, but that's a completely other conversation for another day. One thing that, now, with the way your Planeswalker Spark activates varies a bit from person to person. The most common way is near-death experience, but a severely traumatic experience can also cause it to activate. So you could have a situation where your PCs are all people who have the Planeswalker Spark, and you could have a villain like Ajax from Deadpool, where going around torturing people trying to activate their spark or kill them and doesn't much care which. You could also have it be a situation where some entity is trying to kill their planeswalker spark or trying to extract their planeswalker spark, and presumably the extraction would kill them as well. So that could be a really interesting moment and something that would be a lot of fun, I think, as a DM. Maybe not as much fun as a player, but you might make it work. Say you have a level 5 party and something happens that activates your sorcerer's planeswalker spark. One way you could do that as an in-game mechanic is all of a sudden all the spells they cast are now level 20 until they learn how to control it. So think of that player who casts Fireball. We didn't script that moment. Or your bard who jokingly is trying to seduce everything that moves, and now all of a sudden everything's a natural 20 because that's their planeswalker ability.
Yes, but you do have to be careful with the rules around planeswalkers just because they're so utterly broken. We were not joking when we said that the original planeswalkers were near godlike. It was addressed that they could create entire worlds of their own. That's how Mirrodin came into existence. And so with D&D especially, you have to really keep that in mind. In fact, to go with the example of activating a planeswalker spark, if Nicobolas is attacking the party, there is no way even a level 20 party in the D&D universe would be able to take on Nicobolas. It's just not a reality given Nicobolas' relative power. So what you could do, for example, is have them badly lose to Nicobolas, and then their Planeswalker Spark activates at the last moment and then zaps them to a safer place. As that's the other thing about Planeswalker Sparks, is usually, but not always, when they activate, the person is teleported to a different plane, which is how they discover they have that ability.
Which is really exciting because you're in the middle of losing a fight for your life, and then all of a sudden you wake up not only someplace you've never been, but on a world you've never been to, and these are beings that might not even be aware of the existence of other planes.
Yes, and on top of that, just there's a lot of ways you could do this, but just make sure that the balance of the Planeswalker Spark does work within your specific world. Obviously, every campaign setting is going to have a different level of power, and with the monsters and such, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I would make the Planeswalker Spark, at least in early levels, more similar to the Wild Magic Sorcerer abilities, just because I really don't think, from what we've seen of other Planeswalkers, that they would have any control of it early on, but maybe as they level up, the chances of something bad happen get narrowed down and their abilities become more refined. That's how I would go about it.
Now, as interesting as the Planeswalkers are, there are a lot of other options within the MTG multiverse that you could have. As I mentioned, Lorwyn converts to Shadowmoor, the dark reflection of itself. That could be a really interesting campaign situation where the party is somehow, either they're from there or they get stuck there, and they're the only, when the shift happens, the beings that live on Lorwyn aren't aware of it. They just change and have no memory of their former selves or their former world. If the party are the only beings on the world that know that it happened, that creates a really interesting situation. Additionally, there's, as previously mentioned, the world of Innistrad, which is overrun with vampires and other monsters, so that's a great grimdark setting. Also, some iconic villains you could play around with that have existed on multiple worlds. One of them are called the Slivers. They operate like an insect hive, and when one of them gains an ability or an immunity, they all gain it. So there again, your caster whose option is to fireball everything. If one of those slivers that they're fireballing survives, the whole hive will gain resistance to fire damage, and you can play around with the rules on that, but you could even say, okay, you've done this a few times, you've been through this a few times with them after a few combats, they're now all immune to all fire damage. And yeah, you're going to have to think of something else real quick, Mr. Sorcerer. And they could, and it's not just something like that. It could also be, if they're getting shot with a lot of arrows, piercing damage, bludgeoning damage, whatever it is. So the party would have to keep coming up with new ways to deal with them. And then the last villain I want to mention, although you'd be at this absolutely all day because there are just so many things. This game has been around since the 90s. There are beings called the Eldrazi, which actually exist in the spaces between the planes. The way they feed is by extracting mana, the magical energy of the plane. So to the Eldrazi, an Eldrazi Titan is an unfathomably massive being. But to an Eldrazi Titan, human beings or goblins or elves or whatever, we're not what they eat. So the world is what they eat. So what we are isn't like a grape. What we are is the yeast that grows on the skin of the grape. So they're the closest thing I could think of to compare them to is an Elder Evil. The thing that changes with the Eldrazi, though, is that unlike an Elder Evil, which conceivably might want something in particular, the Eldrazi, it's just an infinite hunger. And much like the Elder Evils, you wouldn't be necessarily dealing with them right away. They have swarms of minions and corrupting influence that they send into the worlds before they attack.
Yes, think of them a bit like perhaps like the Titans from Attack on Titan, or even just as entirely separate gods of their own right. There's so many things you can do with them, and an important note is they change forms based on what plane they're on. That was addressed with Emrukiel as she became more powerful on planes where insanity was already a problem. And my final note is that the final interesting setting is perhaps a little more slower paced than these other ones. You're not fighting off an imminent invasion, but the aforementioned Phyrexia had something called Phyrexian oil, which functioned very similar to a disease. It spreads, it corrupts life, it tends to infuse them with metal 9 times out of 10, and so you could have an entire campaign setting where a single drop of that oil is making its way onto your plane, or you could even do something even crazier where perhaps the slivers have come and some genius king has the idea to use the oil to try and create anti-sliver weaponry, which is how Phyrexia came to be in the first place, and then have your characters try to stop that. Now, my final thoughts before we wrap up this video are that there's something in the D&D system, or in the Magic the Gathering system, called mana, which is color-based. In fact, there's entire cards around devotion to mana, which is the more of that color you have. And so there's 5 of them, so what you could do to incorporate that system into D&D is have certain spells have mana values and then have that have a bonus. Fire spells are the best example of this, but necromancy would be a great example of dark mana, and so on and so forth, and you could have bonuses the more you use it, very similar to the level up system. In fact, I would argue if you're playing a necromancer and you use exclusively necromancy spells, perhaps just throw a little extra XP their way every time. Things like that. Very minor, but a great way to integrate things into the universe.
Now, we've focused a lot on storytelling recently, even our videos about how to create certain characters for D&D, Loki, Harley Quinn, Black Widow, which you should definitely go watch all of those. Something I've found as I've gotten more proficient in DMing is that whereas it used to be all about the combat, that used to be the most fun and interesting part of the game, if you're not very careful, combat actually turns into the dullest part of the game. It turns into everybody's in a stationary position, either using weapon attacks or spells against opponents that are also in a stationary position. So, next time we're going to talk about how to spice up combat. We hope you've enjoyed this video. We thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, share, and comment.